So let's talk about leadership. And let's talk about raising your leadership quotient. This is very important. Everything that you do in life is about your level of leadership. And leadership is the art of influence. It is about influencing people to get things done. It was an interesting thing. On the internet today, there's a visual word dictionary. You can go to this and put in any word, and it will give you other words that are close to that word or have some connection to that word. It's an interesting experience to go through and look at some words because you can learn more about their meanings and you can learn more about the subtleties of their meanings. When I put leadership into this, this is what came up. Status, position, leader, power, ability, leaders, and leading. Now remember that. That's interesting. That's sort of the common idea of leadership. Now, everything you do in life, absolutely everything you do in life, is impacted by your leadership, and you will rise to the level of your leadership. Think about it. In your family, your ability to lead that family, well or ill, the way you do it makes a difference. Your family is successful, and you are successful if you are a better leader. Your community, your job, all of these things require leadership, unless you work with no other people and interact with no other people. And I can't think of a job that does that. Even computer programmers in the software company that I work with have to interact with other people. So their level of leadership determines their level of success and happiness in many cases. So what I would like to do is talk to you today about 7 secrets of leadership. And when you talk to your folks about leadership, there's some interesting things that you can do. For instance, how many of you teach leadership to your teams? Raise your hand. Okay, you probably teach daily by example, right? Do you have formal courses? Who has a formal course on leadership? Interesting, not very many. 1 or 2 hands showed up. If leadership is so important, what do you do to teach leadership to your team members and to learn from your team members about leadership? Now, what can you do? For instance, a simple thing you can do is you can have a leadership lunch. Every week, I have a leadership lunch with my team, and we take a book. We read a book on leadership. We read 1 chapter each time. We read that chapter, and then we discuss leadership, and I provide them lunch. So they get a lunch, and you could brown bag this. You don't have to pay for their lunch. But you get together, and you talk about leadership, and you discuss it. This helps raise not only your individual leadership quotient by studying and thinking about leadership, but it also raises your team leadership IQ. Because it's really important that the team understand leadership and understand the roles of leadership in getting things done and getting things done properly. Now, the best thing that I can offer to you is, when you discuss leadership, tell stories. Most people don't want to see lists of values. Most people don't want to talk about philosophy, but they love hearing about stories. So I'm going to give you 7 secrets today about leadership. Now, you can't tell anybody these secrets. No, you can. Go ahead and tell them. In fact, I want you to tell them these secrets. Most of these secrets you know, but for some reason, many people and many leaders don't seem to remember them when they're leading. So we'll talk about these 7 secrets in 7 different stories. First, these are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Thomas Paine. Let me take you back in time to tell you this story. In 1775, the Americans decided they wanted to be free of Great Britain. The British marched on Lexington and Concord. The shot heard round the world occurred. We realized that they were going to compel us by force to disarm and to obey all their laws without representation. And for Americans, this was tyranny. So an army assembled, a leaderless army. and it sieged the British in Boston. And the British were outnumbered about 7-1. Even though the Americans were not trained soldiers, the regiment in Boston was surrounded. And this was, again, 1775. General George Washington was appointed to be the commander-in-chief. He arrives in July of 1775. He sees an army that is not much more than a mob, a bunch of militias. He brings them together, he appoints leaders, he starts training, he does everything he can to get this army organized, but it's a tough situation because the British are the best army in the world. However, they're still sieged in Boston. Now, through some really smart moves and some clever use of subordinate leaders, he gets cannon from Ticonderoga. They move 350 miles on sleds, these cannons down from Fort Ticonderoga. He's able to put them on Dorchester Heights, and with only enough rounds, enough ammunition to fire 2 rounds per gun, he bluffs the British out of Boston, and they surrender Boston without burning it, and the British Army leaves, and there are no more British soldiers in America. And this is now 1776, in March of 1776. What a wonderful thing. America's won its liberty. Well, guess what? The British are coming back, and they're coming back with a vengeance. Now, as you know, in July of 1776, we declare independence. Second Continental Congress in Philadelphia decides that the United States ought to be free. And so we become an independent nation. This, of course, enrages King George. The British are coming back with the largest armada they ever created, the biggest force that they ever had up until D-Day, June 1944, largest invasion fleet the British had ever mustered. Their ships arrive with thousands of soldiers and some of the meanest mercenary soldiers on earth called Hessians. These Hessians were German mercenaries who fought for the King of England. And when they engage Washington's men in New York, Washington is beaten in every battle. No matter what he does, no matter how hard he tries, his young army, which doesn't know how to fight, is overmatched, outwitted, and outflanked by the professional British soldiers and German mercenaries. Washington's army, which started off about 40,000 men in Boston, even more if you count some of the militias who are in the area, is dwindling. He loses in New York. He loses important forts in New York and New Jersey. He's driven through New Jersey, and in December of 1776, only a few months after the Declaration of Independence, the United States Army is down to 1,000-some men. Washington has 1,800 soldiers, some of them as young as 14 years old. What were you doing when you were 14? Some of these guys got their shoes in July, but have been marching so much that they don't have shoes anymore because shoes just wear away. We can't imagine shoes wearing away. I assure you, you march enough and your boots wear out. When I was in Ranger School, I had to carry an extra pair of boots in my rucksack, and I actually wore out boots that I had to put new boots on. These guys didn't have a second pair of boots. So Washington is now in December in New Jersey trying to escape from the British Army as they are chasing him, trying to cut his men down and finish the revolution. With his 1,800 guys and a few other hundred from different elements that are led by 2 other generals, he's able to cross the Delaware River and get into Pennsylvania. He takes all the boats that he can find in December along the Delaware coast, and Delaware River, around both coast of Pennsylvania and New Jersey, and brings those boats in so the British can't easily cross that river. And then he pulls his men into camp and waits for some of the other folks to show up. He's hoping that the army will coalesce where he is in Pennsylvania so that he can then decide what his next move is. General Howe, the British commander, says, "We've got the fox. He's going to be completely outgunned when we fight him. We're going to win this battle. We don't have to rush. Send your men into winter quarters. And you Hessians, under a guy named Colonel Rahl, I want you to go to a place called Trenton. And I want you to set your guys up in Trenton. You're 1,500 mercenary soldiers with the best weapons, the best cannon, and the best, most fiercely trained and drilled force in the entire world." Washington's 1,800 men in Pennsylvania form up a camp gather their weapons, and Washington has to decide what to do. Now, many of you know this story. Some of you have seen the picture of Washington crossing the Delaware that we all like to look at, standing on the boat with the flag and all. That was actually a very heroic painting that was painted in the 1850s. This is probably more of what it looked like. So General George Washington knows that the entire revolution is at stake. The Congress, which is in Philadelphia, has fled. They send Washington a letter. They say, "Good luck, you're in charge." 1,800 men. Many of them 14, 15, 16-year-old lads. Some of them as old as 60. One of the generals shows up a couple days before Christmas, General Gates. General Gates was trained in the British Army. He brings with him 800 men. General Washington has a meeting and says, "General Gates, tomorrow is Christmas. I intend to form the army, cross the Delaware River at night, and attack the Hessians at Trenton the day after Christmas. What do you think of my plan?" Gates, who's just got back from escaping the British lines with his 800 men, again, who is a trained professional soldier who was trained by the British, says, "You would not like to know what I think." Washington says, "Please, sir, tell me." He says, "You're a fool. You can't win, so you seek annihilation. You're no soldier. Your men are no soldiers." Now, any reasonable man, any reasonable leader would have looked at that situation and said, "That guy's right. We don't stand a chance." But Washington was an unreasonable man. And God bless him, he was unreasonable for us. He said, "General Gates, that's exactly why we're going to win. Because they're not going to be ready for us. And Alexander Hamilton, I want you to put your gun on General Gates and drive him out of this camp. Don't let him see any of his men, but he's leaving." And Alexander Hamilton takes Gates away. Gates runs off to find Congress someplace in Boston. And Washington sets up the plan and the attack, and he gets his trusted officers together, leaders that he's been training for months. Henry Knox, Colonel Glover, who's in charge of the river crossing, Nathaniel Greene. These are all people that you should know about because they are American leaders that created our republic. And he gets his small band of forces onto these barges. They're called Durham boats. They were carrying coal. They were used by a company that would ferry coal back and forth across the river. And the reason they're standing in the boats is because there's water in the bottom of them. They're barely afloat. They carry about 18 to 20 men each, depending on the size. Some are bigger. And they get across that river. Now, his plan is to cross that river by midnight, assemble the army, march the 8 miles to Trenton, and hit the Hessians before they wake up. Now, he believes that they're going to have had a great party on Christmas, so he's hoping that they will be relaxed and not ready when he attacks. What he doesn't know is that Colonel Joachim Rall, the Hessian commander of the Hessians at Trenton, is a stern disciplinarian. He has his men up every morning at stand to in formation with their weapons ready to fight. Every morning. Washington starts crossing the Delaware. Boat after boat makes the trip back and forth in the cold and one of the worst winters they've seen. Huge chunks of ice. The snow is coming down. The rain and sleet is coming down intermittent. It's coming down straight. It's coming down slanted. It's coming down fierce. He plans 2 other attacks, one to the north and one to the south of him. Both will cross the river so they can go around Trenton and completely surround Trenton. Both of those attacks, north and south, can't get across the river. Only Washington can get across the river because at his point, the water is passable. Throughout the night, he conducts the night river crossing. Soldier after soldier after soldier gets in the barge, and they have weapons called muskets. If any of you have ever fired a musket, you know that a flint firing musket, one that fires with a flint for its source of ignition, has a pan with powder in it. You know the term flash in the pan? That means that flash in the pan means that it's flashed and it didn't set off the weapon. Well, what's worse is when there's no flash at all. Because if the pan powder is wet, then the gun won't fire. The musket will not ignite. His men are crossing this river in the sleet, in the rain, in the snow. They get on the other side, they put some fires together, they huddle together as best they can because the weather is absolutely freezing. 2 men die of hypothermia on the far side. Washington gets word that the river crossing is taking too long. They will not cross by midnight. They'll be lucky to get across, everyone, including the cannon, which he needs, by 3 in the morning. Washington says, carry on. They continue the crossing. At 3 in the morning, the army's assembled. At about 4 in the morning, they're about ready to go. He starts to move the army out. Nathaniel Greene is one of his generals, a stalwart man, young officer, says, sir, the powder's all wet. No one will be able to shoot. Only a few muskets will be able to fire. Washington says, we'll use the bayonet. He's determined. They start the march. They come to Jacobs Creek. No big deal. It's a creek. Unfortunately, the weather is so bad that this creek is 6 foot down straight ice, a little ditch, and 6 foot up straight ice. And he's got cannon, and there's no bridge. Henry Knox, his capable and determined artillery commander, comes to him and says, General, I can't get the cannon across this creek. Washington says, Henry, cross the creek. Knox takes the cannon apart, lowers them down the ditch on ropes, pulls them up the ditch on ropes, gets them to the other side. They're delayed even further. The sun is rising. The Hessians will be ready. Washington moves his army forward. As he's getting ready, getting closer to Trenton, a militia captain with an outrider, 2 riders and himself, shows up. A New Jersey militiaman, a captain. He says, George Washington, General Washington, great to see you. You should have seen what we did to those guys last night. We shot them up. Washington's face goes white. He goes, what? He's planning on a surprise attack. He says, yeah, a couple of my boys, we found one of those Hessian camps and we shot at them. Killed 1 or 2 of them, we think. Washington says, sir, I think you've ruined us, because now the Hessians will be ready. Greene looks at Washington and says, what do we do? Washington says, victory or death. We go forward. The army continues to move. They arrive at Trenton. The Hessians are not up. That militia captain had gone out on Christmas night, raised havoc. Rahl had assembled all his men, had been out most of the night looking for them, came back at 4 in the morning and said, to heck with this, nobody would attack in this weather, go to bed. Washington moves in. Sullivan takes one of the forces around, one of his generals, to one of the roads so they can hit Trenton from one side. Washington hits it from the other. 8 in the morning, the attack begins, and the Hessians are still asleep. The powder in their guns is mostly wet. The Americans attack with the bayonet. The whole battle lasts about 90 minutes. Henry Knox's cannon, which were vital, were the only thing that could really fire, and they bring firepower to the battle and win. Colonel Rahl, the Hessian commander, is shot by a musket ball by an ingenious young American soldier about 19 years old who waxed his flash pan. The little pan on top of the powder, he waxed it so it would stay dry, and he opened it up, and he fired and shot Rahl in the chest. And at the same time, another soldier who had done the same thing, because several of the Pennsylvanians had done this, Rahl got hit twice, fell off his horse. The Hessians surrender. Washington loses not a single man, only the 2 that died of hypothermia. About 22 Hessians are killed, 80 are wounded badly, and over 900 prisoners. He saves the revolution. The day after Christmas, 1776. So when you have Christmas the next time with your team or your family, you tell them a Christmas story like that, and then they'll understand why leadership's important and why we're blessed to be Americans. So the first secret of leadership is that fear is a reaction and courage is a decision. Leaders decide on courage. It is the fundamental principle. It makes all the difference. Leaders choose courage. And you know this because you face it. It's the fundamental requirement of leadership. Without courage, you cannot lead. It takes courage to stand up in front of your team. It takes courage to shoulder responsibility. Courage is the first secret. Secret number 2. Who is this guy? Somebody must have seen this before, right? This is Aristotle. Who is Aristotle the teacher of? Anyone know? Some minor Greek guy who conquered the world, Alexander the Great. Aristotle was his teacher. What's interesting about Alexander the Great is that his leadership is tremendous. What he did and how he inspired his soldiers and how he inspired people to form a completely new organization, a kingdom, an empire under his command, was largely because of his personal leadership and, I believe, largely because of lessons he learned from Aristotle. And that lesson is this. So write that down. But you know this lesson. You know this lesson because your parents probably taught you this lesson. And if you didn't, you learned this lesson certainly the first time you had to be a leader. And it is basically this. You must learn to obey before you can be a good commander. Now, if you understand the Greek a bit better, what it really means is this. You must be a good follower before you can learn to be a good leader. Now, there's a lot in that statement. First of all, what kind of person do you want on your team? The whining, complaining, it can't be done, always arguing with you kind of guy? Or the person who says, okay, I understand that. I'll debate the issues with you, but if you say that's what we're going to do, by God, we're going to get it done. Well, most of us want that kind of guy, that kind of gal on our team. So being a good follower is really important because it involves selflessness. All of us are followers. We all follow someone. We have to give up of ourselves something, our time, our energy, part of our life. Maybe our lives in the sense of what you do as firefighters and first responders and what soldiers do and policemen. So being a good follower is a prerequisite to being a good leader and to learning how to lead. Because if you learn selflessness, then you can be a leader. If you never learn selflessness, you may lead, but you'll be one of those leaders that has his ladder climbing of success up against the wrong wall. And eventually, that will come back home to change your organization and bring you failure, or at least not success in the way that you could if you understood selflessness. So, selflessness is a vital component of being a good follower and being a good leader, and you learn it by being a good follower. So all of us need to be better followers. Think about how many times your boss, your superior leader, your leader, needed your help. If you are there to be the person that's a good follower to help him or her, he'll never forget that. They'll never forget that. You'll get the mission accomplished much better. When things get tough, that's when people start arguing and falling apart. Being a good follower makes all the difference. It doesn't mean blind obedience, but it means being a good follower, understanding how to support the mission and get the intent accomplished. And here's a quote by D. Hawk, who was CEO. He said, if you don't understand that you work for your mislabeled subordinates, meaning they're not subordinate, then you know nothing of leadership. You only know tyranny. All of us have worked under tyrants at one point in our lives. Learn from that. Teach your team about followership, and they'll learn to be good leaders. And they learn best by watching you. So if you say, oh, those guys at platoon headquarters are all screwed up, they don't know anything, all the time, then they will say the same thing. If you act that way, they will act that way.